2 days after silence swallowed the Brentwood house, those closest to Rob Reiner realized something terrifying had already passed them by. Not a warning, not a scream, just quiet. A home once filled with laughter, arguments about movies, and late-night conversations had become a place no one could reach in time. And long before the world knew what happened inside those walls, one man already carried the weight of knowing he had tried to stop it. His name was Billy Crystal, and what he later confessed would haunt him for the rest of his life. Those closest to Rob Reiner were overcome by a grief that words struggled to carry. Just 2 days after the celebrated filmmaker behind When Harry Met Sally and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were found unresponsive in their Los Angeles home, friends stood frozen between disbelief and mourning. The house in Brentwood had always been alive. It was a place of routine laughter, shared meals, and long conversations that stretched deep into the night. Now it stood painfully still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. For many, the loss felt unreal. But for Billy Crystal, it felt personal in a way he was not prepared to face. Alongside several longtime friends, Billy released a joint statement honoring Rob and Michelle. Publicly, it was dignified, measured, respectful. Privately, it was something else entirely. When Billy later spoke in confidence, his voice carried a heaviness that could not be hidden. He admitted something that had been eating away at him since the news broke. "I warned him," he said quietly, "and he didn't listen." The words came with visible strain. Rob Reiner had been Billy's closest friend for most of his life. Not just a collaborator, not just a creative partner, but someone woven into his personal world for decades. Billy struggled to describe the pain because it wasn't only grief, it was regret. As he eventually opened up, what he revealed pointed to tensions inside the Reiner household that had existed quietly for years. Pressure Rob carried without complaint, fears he rarely allowed himself to voice, and one private conversation that now felt impossible to escape. In this story, we look back at what Billy knew, what he tried to warn Rob about, and the moment that, in hindsight, felt like the last chance to change everything. According to Billy Crystal's later recollections, shared privately with a small group of reporters, a key meeting took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was November 30th, just 14 days before everything would unravel. Billy arrived at Rob's Brentwood home shortly after 4 o'clock. The visit followed a brief phone call initiated by Rob himself. His voice, Billy would later recall, was calm, direct, stripped of its usual warmth. Only one sentence came through clearly. "I need to talk to you for a bit." Rob added something else almost immediately, lowering his voice as if the house itself might be listening. "It's not about movies." The moment Billy stepped through the door, something felt off. Rob Reiner stood in front of him, looking worn down in a way Billy had never seen before. The familiar confidence was missing. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his sleeves rolled higher than usual, and his hair lacked its normal care. When they shook hands, Rob's grip felt weaker, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Billy sensed that whatever Rob had been carrying was no longer staying inside his head. It had begun to take a physical toll. Rob led him into the living room, but did not turn on the television. No background music, no casual routine that usually marked Billy's visits. He poured a glass of water and set it on the table, but he never took a sip. Throughout the silence that followed, Rob's eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, leading deeper into the house. It was a small detail, but it struck Billy immediately. Rob had never seemed tense in his own home. After several long moments, Rob spoke. His voice was lower than usual, rougher. "Things in my family are a mess right now," he said. "I haven't told anyone, but I'm exhausted." When Billy asked him to explain, Rob didn't hesitate. He spoke about his son, Nick, about a serious setback earlier that month that had changed his behavior in unsettling ways. Rob described sudden irritability, short tempers, evenings where tensions escalated so quickly that Michelle would step away just to prevent arguments from spiraling out of control. He mentioned a heated disagreement in the kitchen about finances and long-term care shortly before Thanksgiving. Rob refused to repeat the words that were said, but he admitted that moment stayed with him. What troubled Rob most was something deeper. He said he could no longer predict his son's reactions. As Rob spoke, he went quiet again. He lifted his hand, rubbed his forehead, and stared down at the floor. Billy would later say that image never left him. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, the kind seen in someone holding on to hope while quietly running out of strength. Rob explained that he was trying to keep his son close, believing family proximity might help restore balance. Then he said something Billy would replay in his mind again and again. "I'm afraid that if I push him away," Rob said slowly, "I'll be the last person who makes him fall apart." Billy noticed Rob's fingers were tightly interlocked as he spoke, a small but revealing sign of someone fighting to keep control over emotions threatening to spill out. That was when Billy finally sat up straighter. For the first time that afternoon, he spoke firmly. He told Rob he understood the kind of father he was trying to be, but he also warned him that what he was describing was dangerous. Not abstract danger, not emotional speculation, real risk. Billy stressed that these behaviors couldn't be brushed aside simply because they involved family. Trusting love, he said, was natural, but this situation required boundaries, not a silence. Rob listened without interrupting. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes looked strained. His voice dropped even further as he replied that he understood the concern, but he couldn't bring himself to see his son as a threat. Rob said Nick had already endured too much pain in his life. He feared that one wrong step at the wrong moment could cause everything to collapse. When he finished speaking, Rob leaned back and released a long breath. The room fell into a heavy stillness. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out toward the backyard, a place filled with decades of quiet family memories. Eventually, Rob turned back, placed a hand gently on Billy's shoulder, and said he would think everything over again. Billy left the house as dusk settled over Brentwood. An uneasy feeling followed him for days. It was one of the very few times Billy Crystal had ever walked away from that home with a single thought repeating in his mind. Something was deeply wrong, and it was quietly unfolding beneath the surface. It was that private conversation, the one Billy would replay over and over after the tragedy became public, that caused everything about the Brentwood house to look different. In hindsight, it felt as though the warning signs had always been there. They just didn't look like warning signs until it was too late. Billy later said that when he first learned what had happened inside that home, his immediate reaction was disbelief, not because he thought tragedy was impossible, but because the sequence of events did not resemble the Rob he had known For decades, Rob Reiner was not a man who let things drift, especially not when it came to family. The Brentwood home had never been a place of extended quiet. It ran on consistent routines, people coming and going, scheduled visits, a steady rhythm that made silence feel unnatural. Yet what shocked Billy most was this. Everything only came to attention when someone arrived as planned, knocked repeatedly, and received no response. That detail unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain at first, because it meant something had already been wrong for hours, maybe longer, and no one outside the house had known. Billy kept circling back to one question. How could so much time pass without anyone noticing? He began paying close attention to the earliest accounts of how the scene was discovered, how family members first entered the home, what they saw, what they didn't see, and one detail lodged itself into his mind like a splinter. When Romy entered the house, she saw her father first and immediately ran back outside in distress. Michelle was in another part of the home and was discovered later. Billy couldn't stop thinking about that separation because it suggested something specific. They were not together in the same moment. And in Billy's memory, Rob had once shared something that now returned like an echo. Tension in that home, he had said, didn't always explode all at once. It moved slowly from room to room, in stages. Now, the image Billy formed of what happened seemed to follow the same pattern Rob had described, and that realization chilled him. Another detail Billy couldn't move past was the length of time before anyone outside became aware. He knew there had been a significant delay between when events occurred and when the outside world learned anything. That silence did not align with the man he had known. Rob reacted quickly. He'd stayed alert. He was the type to call, to check in, to respond. So how could the house remain quiet for so many hours? That question dragged Billy back to something Rob had said during their private conversation. Rob had described moments when the atmosphere inside the home became eerily still. At the time, Billy thought it was an emotional description, a figure of a speech, but now it sounded like something else. Billy also reflected on what he later heard about the condition of the house. According to people familiar with the scene, the furniture and the surrounding spaces appeared largely untouched. For Billy, that detail mattered because having spent countless hours in that home, he knew exactly what normal looked like inside those walls. And that familiarity did not support the idea of an outside presence. Everything still reflected Rob and Michelle's routines, their habits, their ordinary life. To Billy, that made it even more disturbing because it suggested the tragedy didn't arrive like a storm from the outside. It unfolded right in the middle of the most familiar setting possible. Then there was Romy's reaction. Billy said the level of distress described to him suggested something far beyond what any family member could ever be prepared to face. He recognized that feeling. He compared it to his own reaction when he first read the earliest accounts. But what troubled Billy most, more than the silence, more than the separation, more than the untouched home, was what was missing. Nick wasn't there when everything came to light. Billy avoided drawing conclusions publicly, but privately he admitted something that made his stomach tighten. That detail brought him straight back to that afternoon in Brentwood, back to Rob's tired eyes, back to his confession that he could no longer predict his son's reactions when tension reached a breaking point. And when Billy connected every detail, he came to believe something painful. What happened wasn't an isolated event. It was the final point in a long chain of warning signs that had existed long before anyone recognized them. From that moment on, the story began to shift in Billy's mind. While much of the public was still trying to piece together scattered information coming out of Brentwood, Billy Crystal found himself focused on a very different question. Not what had happened, but who had left the house before anyone outside understood what was going on. When Billy learned that Nick was not present when the situation came to light, a familiar heaviness settled in his chest. It was the same feeling he had carried weeks earlier when he left Rob's home after their private conversation. Billy had never viewed Nick as a distant or abstract figure. Nick, whose full name was Nicholas Reiner, had been the source of Rob's deepest concern for years. Over time, Rob had spoken openly about his son's struggles, repeated setbacks, attempts to regain stability, moments of hope followed by disappointment. Those struggles had gradually taken a toll on the entire family. Billy remembered Rob telling him about a period when Nick nearly disappeared from family life altogether. He moved from place to place, cut off contact for long stretches of time. So when Billy learned Nick was not at the house when everything was discovered, it immediately pulled him back to Rob's earlier admission that he could no longer predict his son's reactions once pressure reached a breaking point. But there was another detail that made Billy's unease deepen. Through quiet industry conversations, he learned that Rob and Nick had a tense exchange the previous evening during a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. Several attendees recalled that Nick appeared unusually unsettled that night, emotionally unstable, on edge. Hearing that shook Billy, because it mirrored exactly what Rob had described weeks earlier. Moments when Nick became increasingly difficult to manage as tension escalated. Billy then learned something else. Nick had left the Brentwood area before anyone outside the house became aware that something was wrong. He was later located several miles away that same evening. To Billy, that distance mattered. It aligned with how Rob had described his son's behavior during moments of confusion or emotional overload, withdrawal, movement, disappearance. As developments continued to surface, Billy followed them closely, quietly, without speaking publicly. And then came the moment that left him deeply shaken. Images later emerged of Nick appearing in a courtroom setting under supervision. When Billy saw them, every concern he had ever shared with Rob suddenly felt real in the most painful way possible. According to what Billy learned, Nick remained in custody while legal proceedings continued, with future court dates expected in early 2026. At that point, Billy no longer believed what happened in Brentwood was sudden or unpredictable. To him, it looked like the outcome of long-standing struggles that had quietly intensified over time, pressures that had been building beneath the surface unseen by the outside world. What caused Billy the deepest heartbreak was not just the tragedy itself, it was the realization that Nick was the very person Rob had tried hardest to protect. For Billy Crystal, one detail kept rising above everything else. Not the headlines, not the speculation, not the whispering that moved through Hollywood like fog, but the single truth that broke his heart the most. Rob Reiner had tried, not in a vague, distant way, not in the way people say he did his best after it's already over, Billy believed Rob had been trying for years to hold his son close enough to keep him from falling apart. And in Billy's eyes, one project stood out as the clearest proof of that fight, the film being Charlie. To the public, it was just another creative title in Rob's long career. But to Billy, it felt like something far more personal. He believed it represented Rob's final attempt to guide Nick toward a stability, a way of giving him a structure, purpose, a path back toward balance. Rob had once hoped the project might serve as a turning point, a bridge, a chance to rebuild what kept slipping away. But over time, the deeper issues remained unresolved. And when Billy later saw Nick taken into custody, something inside him collapsed. It felt like watching hope die in real time. In private conversations with close friends, Billy admitted that his concerns hadn't formed overnight, not because he wanted to assume the worst, not because he didn't believe in second chances, but because the warning signs kept stacking up. Rob's confessions, the tense exchange at the holiday gathering, Nick's absence when everything came to light, and then the courtroom images, each piece connected into a pattern Billy could no longer ignore. And once the story moved from personal concern into formal legal proceedings, Billy understood something painful. A new phase had begun. A phase where loyalty and affection were no longer enough to protect the truth that would continue to surface. According to a longtime friend in Beverly Hills, Billy withdrew from his usual routines. He stopped visiting familiar restaurants. He skipped year-end gatherings that had been planned in advance. He spent days inside his home, leaving only once to quietly drive through Brentwood, then returning without speaking to anyone. Those around him sensed he was retreating into private grief. Because for Billy, losing Rob Reiner wasn't like losing an ordinary friend. It felt like losing a part of his inner world. Rob had been the first person Billy called with good news, and the one he turned to when he felt uncertain, the voice he trusted when the world felt loud. What hurt most wasn't only the loss itself. It was that it happened when Billy wasn't there beside him. Friends said Billy replayed their final conversation repeatedly. Rob's tired eyes, his lowered voice, that line that sounded like a father's love, and now felt like a warning nobody could undo. And Billy admitted something that carried the weight of a confession. He sensed something was wrong, yet he still believed Rob could manage on his own. That belief became the heaviest burden he carried afterward, because it left him questioning everything. Should he have stayed longer, spoken more firmly, pushed harder, or did the danger already sit too close? Long before he ever walked through that door, a quiet rumor began to circulate among those close to Billy Crystal. They said he went back through his call history, not once, not casually, again and again, as if somewhere inside the numbers and timestamps, he might find a moment he could still change. He reread old messages exchanged with Rob Reiner, short notes, casual jokes, small everyday lines that used to feel meaningless. Now they felt unbearable. One friend later recalled Billy saying privately, in a voice that sounded more like surrender than speech, "I thought I still had plenty of time. I was wrong." He repeated that line more than once, not as a complaint, not as a dramatic statement for attention, but as a confession. And alongside the sorrow grew something else, a quiet anger directed entirely inward. Billy did not blame Rob. He did not place responsibility on anyone else, not publicly, not privately. Instead, he criticized himself. for being the kind of friend who listened carefully but didn't push firmly enough when it mattered most. He blamed himself for believing Rob's love for his son would be enough to keep everything steady. That anger didn't explode. It lingered, slowly, like a weight that refused to lift. Friends said it kept him awake night after night. He often woke before dawn, walked through the house in silence, then sat for long stretches staring out the window without turning on a light. Just a stillness, just thinking, because the realization grew heavier as time passed. He had noticed the signs, he had spoken up, he had warned, and none of it was enough. That helplessness, Billy admitted, felt even harder to carry than the loss itself. It left him feeling like a witness and an outsider at the same time. People within the entertainment industry quietly shared that Billy declined television appearances longer than expected, despite a strong interest from major programs. According to someone close to him, Billy said he wasn't ready to speak Rob's name publicly without losing his composure. Each mention brought back memories, and with them, guilt, a renewed sense that he wasn't there when things slowly slipped beyond control. So instead of speaking, he retreated. And during that retreat, Billy began reflecting on nearly 50 years of friendship with Rob, not to search for explanations, not to assign blame, but to protect what remained, to preserve the memories that existed before everything else reshaped them. Because once tragedy enters a story, it tries to rewrite everything that came before it. Billy didn't want that. He wanted to remember Rob as Rob, not as a headline, not as a case, not as a mystery, but as the friend who had been there for him for decades. The friend he called first, the friend he trusted most, and the friend he could never call again. Eventually, Billy chose to speak, but not in the way the public expected. There were no interviews, no studio chairs, no bright lights waiting for him to hold composure while people asked the same questions again and again. Instead, Billy spoke through a joint statement. It was signed alongside his wife, Janice Crystal, and also carried the names of Rob Reiner's closest friends and longtime collaborators, people who had shared decades of history with Rob, people who knew the man behind the camera, not just a famous name. The focus of that statement was not on the events, not on rumors, not on speculation. It was on honoring a bond that had endured for nearly a lifetime, and as it circulated quietly through the industry, those who read it understood something immediately. This wasn't a press release. It was grief given structure. It was the closest thing to a farewell that Billy Crystal could survive putting into the world. The statement included names deeply connected to Hollywood's history, figures who had crossed paths with Rob for decades and who understood what it meant to lose someone like him. It was sent to the Associated Press not as spectacle, but as something dignified, restrained, and heavy with emotion. For Billy, being part of that statement carried a special meaning. It wasn't only a public tribute. It was his way of saying, in the only safe way he could, this man mattered, this friendship was real, and I'm not ready to let the world reduce him to a headline. In the statement, friends reflected on what had connected Billy and Rob from the beginning: a shared love for cinema, for storytelling, for darkened theaters where as strangers could laugh together, reflect together, and sit quietly moved by the same scene. That was the world Rob lived in completely, and Billy had witnessed it from the earliest days, because their friendship didn't begin when the cameras were already rolling on famous films. It began decades earlier in the mid-1970s, back when life still felt simpler and the future hadn't yet demanded its price. Their friendship began in the mid-1970s on the set of All in the Family. Back then, Rob was already a recognized television figure. Billy, on the other hand, was still finding his footing, still learning how to move through rooms where everyone seemed to know exactly who they were. But despite that difference, something clicked between them almost immediately. It wasn't fame that bonded them. It wasn't opportunity. It was a shared way of seeing life, humor that didn't need cruelty to be sharp, thoughtfulness that didn't need performance to feel real, a sincerity that stood out in a world already training people to hide behind masks. What began as conversations after filming slowly became something deeper. Two men who could talk for hours without needing to impress each other. Two men who laughed the same way at the same parts of a story. Two men who understood that comedy, when done right, was often just pain turned into something survivable. Over time, they became close friends, then creative partners, then steady presences in each other's most important chapters. And when Rob moved into directing, the bond didn't weaken, it sharpened. Billy wasn't just an actor Rob cast. He was someone Rob trusted, someone he could exchange ideas with, someone who could shape dialogue, refine emotional beats, and tell the truth without fear of hurting the friendship. That trust would become most visible to the world in one film. When Harry Met Sally, a cultural milestone, yes, but to Billy, it was also a reflection of what existed between them, a creative understanding built on respect, freedom, and the rare kind of collaboration that doesn't feel like work. Billy later said Rob was one of the few directors who allowed him complete freedom, while still offering clear guidance, not control, not ego, just trust. And in the statement, friends described Rob as a master storyteller, someone who moved easily between comedy, drama, and documentary styles. But those words weren't just professional praise. They came from people who had watched Rob respect actors, value writers, and create environments built on collaboration rather than command. For Billy, the hardest part of writing those lines wasn't choosing the right words. It was speaking of Rob in the past tense, because Rob wasn't just a collaborator. He was woven into Billy's personal life. Billy was a familiar presence in Rob and Michelle's Brentwood home. He had sat at that table, shared dinners, shared private conversations about family, society, and the responsibility artists carry. So knowing that Rob and Michelle were gone in that same home shattered something deeper than public grief. It felt like losing a place where some of Billy's most private memories had lived safely. And now those memories felt exposed and broken. The joint statement didn't only honor Rob, it honored Michelle too. Because in the memories of those who truly knew them, Rob and Michelle were never separate stories. They were one partnership, one rhythm, or one steady presence that had lasted for decades. The statement remembered their marriage as something defined by loyalty, resilience, and shared purpose. Not a perfect life, not a spotless picture, but a life built on standing beside each other when the world was loud and when it was quiet. Billy Crystal had long admired Michelle Singer Reiner, not simply as Rob's wife, but as the kind of person who anchored a home with calm strength, someone who didn't chase attention, yet still carried a presence that everyone in that house could feel. And that admiration deepened the loss. Because for Billy, it wasn't only that Rob was gone, It was that two people, inseparably tied to one of the most important chapters of his life, were suddenly absent. And then, near the closing portion of the statement, came a line that struck with a different kind of weight, a quote from It's a Wonderful Life, a film Rob deeply loved. The quote captured the idea that one person can touch countless lives, and when they are gone, the absence they leave behind is immeasurable. Billy understood that meaning in a way that no audience ever could, because for him, the space Rob left behind was not only in cinema history, it was in daily life, in phone calls that would never be returned, in jokes that would never be finished, in conversations that would remain forever incomplete. After nearly 50 years of friendship, Billy speaking publicly wasn't simply a response to loss. It was an intentional act, a way of preserving the truth of who Rob was beyond headlines or speculation, a way of saying to the world, remember him as more than an event, more than a mystery. Remember him as the man who brought warmth into rooms, the man who built stories that made strangers laugh together, the man who stayed loyal, curious, and generous toward those around him, because that was the Rob Billy knew. And the passing of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner was not only a shock within entertainment. To Billy, it marked the quiet and irreversible end of a bond that had lasted almost half a century. Beneath the laughter on a screen and the legacy of classic films remained something far heavier: regret, unanswered questions, and a sorrow that time may never fully soften. And when Billy said, I thought I still had plenty of time, I was wrong, it wasn't just grief, it was the realization that some warnings arrive long before people understand what they mean. Sometimes even recognition is not enough to change the direction events take.